There is a hill in Lebanon, outside the ancient city of Sidon, made almost entirely of broken snail shells. Not a natural deposit, not a reef, a hill built by human hands over the course of roughly 800 years, as craftsmen cracked open millions of murex trunculus snails, squeezed a few drops of fluid from a gland near the base of the shell, and discarded the rest. The midden rises several meters. Archaeologists who have studied its layers found the shells grow progressively smaller toward the top, not because the craftsmen changed their methods, because after centuries of continuous extraction, the large snails were gone. The waters off Sidon had been harvested so thoroughly that the remaining population could no longer reach full size before it was taken. The hill is still there. You can visit it. Nobody has put a sign in front of it explaining what it means. What it means is this: the most powerful empire the Western world has ever produced built its visual language of power, its legal system of status, its entire symbolic economy of authority around a single marine invertebrate. And then it harvested that invertebrate to near extinction over the course of a millennium, never once stopped to account for what was disappearing, and called the resulting crisis a military problem. Before you can understand what was lost, you need to understand what purple actually was in the ancient world. Not a color, a currency, a claim, a statement with the force of law behind it. Pliny the Elder described the murex dye industry in the 9th book of his Natural History, written around 77 CE. He was not enthusiastic. He called the smell of the dye workshops offensive and nauseous. He noted that the dye workers, called purpurari, were required to live and labor at the edge of cities because the stench of decaying shellfish was too severe for residential neighborhoods. He described the extraction process with the precision of someone who had witnessed it: the snail captured alive, the hypobranchial gland harvested, the fluid exposed to sunlight and air until it shifted through yellow, green, and finally fixed into the reddish-violet that the Romans called purpura, the color that did not fade, the color that deepened with age and sun exposure, darkening toward what ancient sources called a coagulated blood hue, which was considered more beautiful than the brighter shade, the color that could not be replicated cheaply, the color that in sufficient concentration cost more than gold, not metaphorically more than gold, legally, commercially, quantifiably more than gold. The Edict of Diocletian, issued in 301 CE to control runaway inflation across the empire, listed price ceilings for hundreds of goods. A pound of the deepest Tyrian purple-dyed silk, the kind reserved for imperial garments, was priced at 150,000 denarii. A skilled laborer earned 25 denarii per day. The math is not subtle. A single pound of imperial purple fabric represented roughly 16 years of wages. You could buy a medium-sized farm, several slaves to work it, and a modest house for what it cost to dye enough cloth for one robe. This was not accidental. The expense was the point. Purple was the visual proof of a status that could not be counterfeited, because the cost of counterfeiting it was prohibitive to anyone who was not the state. Roman sumptuary law made wearing unauthorized purple a capital offense under certain emperors. Not a fine, not a social sanction, death. The color had been weaponized as a moat around power so completely that you could execute a citizen for wearing the wrong fabric. When Byzantine emperors were born in the porphyra, the purple-draped birthing chamber of the imperial palace, their children were given the title porphyrogenetos, born to the purple. The chamber itself was lined with a particular variety of Tyrian purple marble, specifically chosen because its color evoked the dye. An emperor who had been born in that room outranked one who had not, regardless of bloodline. The purple was not symbolizing power. The purple was power, encoded in law, enforced by execution, and resting entirely on the continued availability of a gland inside a sea snail that nobody was managing. The production network that sustained this was staggering in its reach and fragility. The primary harvesting sites ran along the eastern Mediterranean coastline: Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and other Phoenician and later Roman-controlled ports. Secondary sites operated along the North African coast in the Aegean, and eventually in the western Mediterranean. Each site required proximity to the snail beds, access to salt for preservation, and skilled workers who understood the chemistry of a process that had no written formula. The knowledge was passed orally, from master to apprentice, across generations. The workshops were state-controlled monopolies under Rome and even more tightly controlled under Byzantium, where the imperial dye works in Constantinople held exclusive legal authority over the deepest grades of purple production. To export imperial purple without authorization was treason. Thousands of snails went into every garment. The precise figures vary by source and dye concentration, but modern analyses of ancient dye recipes and shell midden composition have consistently produced estimates of several thousand snails per ounce of finished dye. For a full robe, in deep imperial purple, The number climbs into the hundreds of thousands. The shell middens are the physical record of this arithmetic, stacked layer by layer across centuries of production. Here is where the timeline stops adding up, and where the mainstream account of Rome's collapse becomes harder to defend. The conventional explanation for the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE is military and political, barbarian pressure on the frontiers, internal political instability, overextension, economic strain from military spending. These causes are real, they are documented, but they treat the economic strain as a precondition without asking what was straining the economy at its foundation. When historians describe the late Roman and Byzantine fiscal crisis, they note that maintaining the court's ceremonial apparatus became increasingly expensive. They rarely specify that the ceremonial apparatus was, in large part, made of purple cloth, whose cost was rising because the biological source was being systematically depleted. Brian Grasby, a researcher in ancient textile economics, noted in a study of late Roman commercial records that the price of purple dyed goods relative to other luxury textiles increased sharply across the 3rd and 4th centuries at a rate that exceeded general inflation, even accounting for the currency debasements of the period. Something beyond monetary policy was driving the cost upward. The snail beds were thinning. The large specimens that produced the richest dye were becoming harder to find closer to shore. Dye workers were being forced to work farther from port, in deeper water, at greater expense for smaller yields. The shell middens confirm this in their own silent way. Archaeologists studying the midden layers at sites near Sidon and at Carthage, where a secondary murex industry operated from at least the 2nd century BCE, documented the same pattern independently. The shells become progressively smaller in the upper layers. Mark Bradley, a classicist at the University of Nottingham, who has published extensively on colour and perception in the ancient world, has noted that ancient sources themselves begin to complain, by the late Empire, about the difficulty of obtaining true Tyrian purple as opposed to cheaper imitations. The complaints are treated in the historical literature as aesthetic grievances. They are not aesthetic grievances, they are supply chain reports. By the 5th century, the Byzantine court had begun producing sumptuary legislation that did not simply restrict who could wear purple. It restricted the grades of purple that could legally exist outside the imperial workshops. Historians have read this as an attempt to protect imperial prestige. It is also consistent with a government that knew the supply of authentic deep purple was contracting, and needed to ensure that whatever remained was concentrated where it mattered most. You do not pass laws defining which shade of a color the emperor alone may wear, unless the supply of that color has become a matter of state security. The marine biologist Josefina Castellanos, working with archaeological teams studying coastal midden deposits in the eastern Mediterranean, published findings in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2007, showing that murex trunculus populations show clear signatures of overharvesting pressure in sites with documented ancient dye production. The recovery rate for these snails, slow-growing, late to reproduce, is measured in decades under ideal conditions. Under continuous extraction, the beds do not recover, they contract. The deep dye fades from the market. The court adapts, uses thinner concentrations, dilutes with cheaper dyes, passes laws to disguise the substitution. The color continues to exist as a legal category even after it has largely ceased to exist as a material fact. In 1453, Constantinople fell to Ottoman forces under Mehmed II. The Byzantine Imperial dye works, the last state-controlled Tyrian purple operation in the world, were shuttered. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to produce true Tyrian purple from murex snails had effectively vanished from European practice. It would not be recovered until 1998, when a researcher named John Edmonds published a reconstruction of the ancient process after years of experimental archaeology. For 500 years, the formula used to produce the color that had defined imperial legitimacy across 15 centuries of Mediterranean civilization was simply gone, not suppressed, not classified, gone, because the last people who knew it worked in a workshop that closed and nobody thought to write it down before it did. I sat with this research for nearly 2 weeks before the full shape of it became clear. I kept returning to the same question and dismissing it as too simple. The question was, did anyone count the snails? Not metaphorically, literally. Did any administrator, any natural philosopher, any dye master in 800 years of continuous industrial extraction ever attempt to measure whether the population of murex trunculus could sustain the rate of harvest the empire required? The answer, as far as the historical record shows, is no. Pliny catalogued the species. He described the production process. He noted the smell. He calculated the cost. He never asked whether the beds could be exhausted, because the question apparently did not occur to him. The Roman administrative apparatus that tracked grain yields, military manpower, provincial tax receipts, aqueduct capacity, and road maintenance generated no known document that assessed the long-term availability of the biological resource its entire luxury economy depended on. Not one surviving text from any century of Roman or Byzantine administration addresses the sustainability of murex harvesting. This is not a bureaucratic oversight. It is a structural one. The empire was organized to extract. It was not organized to manage what it was extracting from. The snails were a commons, a shared biological resource of the coastal waters that no individual owned and no institution was responsible for maintaining. The workshops competed for the best harvesting grounds. When one site became less productive, they moved to another. When coastal sites thinned, they moved offshore. Each decision was rational for the individual workshop and collectively catastrophic for the resource. This pattern had a name when an economist named Garrett Hardin described it in the journal Science in 1968. He called it the tragedy of the commons. The Roman purple industry was running it 1,000 years before he wrote the paper. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The most expensive substance in the ancient world, the legal foundation of imperial authority, the visual grammar of power encoded in law and enforced with executions, all of it resting on a slow-breeding sea snail that 8 centuries of industrial harvest had quietly pushed toward biological collapse. The price rises, the court economists notice the inflation, the currency is debased to compensate, the barbarian federates on the frontier notice that the payments for their service are arriving in debased coin, the frontier thins, the pressure increases. The narrative of Rome's fall, told in every textbook, is accurate in its facts and almost entirely silent about the biological foundation on which the fiscal system rested. The shell middens sit outside Sidon, the smaller shells toward the top. 800 years of extraction, preserved in a hill that anybody can visit. And the connection is never made. Not because historians lack access to the archaeological record. The middens have been documented. The progressive reduction in shell size has been published. The correlation between dye industry activity and shellfish population stress has been measured. It just exists in different academic journals from the ones that discuss the fall of Rome, and nobody has found it professionally useful to read across the boundary. The purple dye industry was not the only cause. I want to be clear about that. Military overextension was real. Political instability was real. The currency debasement was real. But every one of those downstream causes traces to a state that was spending more than it could collect, and a significant portion of what it was spending on was maintaining the ceremonial apparatus, the purple garments, the purple draped throne room, the purple dyed silks distributed as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers, whose cost was rising because the biological input was becoming scarcer. The empire was funding its own symbolic language of invincibility, with a resource it was running out of, and the moment you understand that, the final centuries of Byzantine austerity read differently. The progressive restriction of purple to narrower and narrower circles of the court, the sumptuary laws that multiply as the genuine article becomes harder to source, the frantic secrecy around the imperial workshops. These are not the behaviors of a confident civilization protecting its prestige. These are the behaviors of an institution managing scarcity it cannot acknowledge. When Mehmed's army entered Constantinople in 1453, one of the first things he sought was the imperial treasury and the imperial robes. The purple of the Byzantine court was not just a trophy. It was, in the symbolic logic of Mediterranean civilization, the object that made you legitimate. The Ottomans did not adopt Tyrian purple as an imperial color. They had their own visual grammar. But the fact that they looked for it, that they understood what it meant, tells you how long the logic held. 8 centuries of extraction, 15 centuries of symbolic dominance, a hill of broken shells on the Lebanese coast that nobody has explained to a general audience. A formula for the color that ruled the world, lost for 500 years because the last people who knew it worked in a room that closed and everyone else had already moved on. The formula came back, eventually. John Edmonds recovered it through experimental archaeology, working backward from ancient texts and chemical analysis of surviving dyed artifacts. True Tyrian purple, the real thing, from murex glands fixed without synthetic substitutes, can be produced again if you have access to the snails, the salt, the sunlight, and the patience to work through a process that smells exactly as Pliny said it did. The murex snail beds in the eastern Mediterranean have partially recovered in the centuries since the industry collapsed. Not to their ancient extent, but they exist. The snails are there, in the waters off Lebanon and Israel and southern Turkey, living the same slow reproductive cycle they have always lived. Nobody is harvesting them commercially. Nobody has calculated what a sustainable yield would look like at modern extraction rates. Nobody knows exactly how far the ancient population contracted at the peak of Roman production, or how far it has recovered since, because the monitoring required to answer those questions was never conducted in antiquity and has not been prioritized since. The hill of shells outside Sidon is still there, the record of what was taken, preserved in broken calcium carbonate, stacked 800 years deep. The waters below it, quieter now, the snails growing, slowly to a size that nobody measured when the extraction was running, and nobody has bothered to measure now that it has stopped. The empire that built its power on their bodies is gone. The snails are still here. That is the part nobody seems to find worth mentioning.